Story 1. Hotel on the road. The highway stretched endlessly before me, illuminated only by the occasional flicker of my headlights. The night was heavy, oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes gritty with exhaustion and the hum of the engine blending into the static noise in my head. Now, when I saw the glowing neon sign for a roadside inn, I almost didn't believe it. The letters buzzed faintly against the dark, spelling out Rest Haven Inn. It looked old, worn down, the kind of place that had probably seen better days decades ago. But I was too tired to care. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, the crunch of the tires strangely loud in the stillness. There were only a couple of other cars, parked haphazardly, their windows fogged from the cold. The building itself was small, a single story with peeling paint and a flickering porch light. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the faint smell of mildew. The man behind the desk was as weathered as the inn itself, grizzled, with deep lines carved into his face and eyes that seemed to hold more secrets than they should. He barely looked up as I approached, sliding an old-fashioned key across the counter with a number tag dangling from it. Room 12. "You'll want to get some rest," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "But don't look out the window after midnight." I blinked, caught off guard by the odd warning. "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer right away, his gaze flicking past me to the dark parking lot outside. "Just don't," he said, finally, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear him. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to late-night paranoia and my own exhaustion. The room was exactly what I expected. Small, shabby, but clean enough. A single bed, a TV bolted to the wall, and a window with heavy curtains that barely covered the cracked glass. I tossed my bag onto the bed and checked my watch. It was just past 11:30 p.m. I told myself I'd get some sleep, but the man's warning gnawed at me, a splinter in my mind I couldn't ignore. Don't look out the window after midnight. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. I lay on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, the sound of my own breathing filling the room. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the thin walls. The minutes ticked by, and I still had no idea how long I stayed like this. Maybe I'd do that forever if I kept. By the time the clock on my phone read 11:59, I was sitting up, staring at the window. I told myself I wasn't scared. There was nothing out there, nothing the old man's warning could have prepared me for. But curiosity is a funny thing. It worms its way into your thoughts, convincing you that you have to know, even when you don't. When the clock struck midnight, I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I got up and walked to the window. My breath fogged the glass as I reached for the curtain, my hand trembling slightly. The sound of windmills tilted the office. I pulled it back. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the empty parking lot, the gravel shining faintly under the weak glow of the porch light. My car sat where I'd left it, the only movement coming from the swaying shadows of the trees beyond. And then I saw him. Me? He was standing in the middle of the lot, bathed in the pale light. His face, my face, was tilted upward, looking directly at me. My heart stuttered in my chest as I stared at him, unable to process what I was seeing, except for the fact that he was bleeding from 2 small cuts on his legs. Words failed me. He was identical to me in every way. Same clothes, same hair, even the same tired slump of the shoulders. But his expression was different. Too calm, too knowing. Then he raised a hand and waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, deliberate, like a predator, toying with its prey. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. As I watched, he began to move. A flash of movement turned to shadow. He was walking toward the building, toward my room. "Ah," he said, And then he disappeared from view, leaving only the sound of gravel crunching under his footsteps. The footsteps outside grew louder, each crunch of gravel like a hammer striking my nerves. I backed away from the window, my chest heaving, my heart slamming against my ribs. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. He was here. I bolted the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone as I fumbled to dial the front desk. The line buzzed once, twice, then clicked. "Oh," said the behemoth of workers in wartime who had now arrived at the front desk. "Don't look outside," the old man said, his voice cold and final. "I already did," I hissed, my voice cracking. There's someone out there. He looks just like me." He pressed his lips together solemnly. His eyes closed long in breaths, as if in reverie. There was a long pause on the other end, and when the old man spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "You've invited him in." The line went dead. A wave of nausea hit me as I stared at the screen. My reflection in the darkened glass of the phone was pale, eyes wide with fear. The silence outside felt deafening now, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and fills your mind with dread. And then the doorknob rattled. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, frozen. It jiggled again, harder this time, as though someone was testing the lock. "Go away," I shouted, my voice shaking. The rattling stopped. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe he'd given up. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it grew louder, harder, until it wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding. The chair under the handle shuddered with every hit, and I could hear the hinges straining against the force. I backed into the corner, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I'll call the police," I screamed, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. I paused, hearing the scraping noise inside of my grandmother's old house. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the thud of my heartbeat, the faint creak of the floorboards. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. Let me in. It was my voice, exactly my voice. The same tone, the same inflection. Hearing it made my skin crawl, the words twisting and echoing in my head. "I know you're in there," it said, softer now, almost coaxing. "You don't need to be scared." The doorknob jiggled again, gently this time, as though he were waiting for me to unlock it. I pressed myself tighter against the wall, shaking my head. "You're not me," I whispered. The voice on the other side laughed, low, soft, and mocking. "Oh, but I am," it said. "And you looked, didn't you? That's all it takes." The wages fell into place, and a quiet life prevailed. Suddenly the pounding resumed, harder and more violent than before. The chair scraped against the floor, the lock rattling with each blow. The door wouldn't hold much longer. And then, as abruptly as it started, it stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. The silence dragged on, stretching like a taut wire. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, he was gone. But then I heard it, the faint creak of the floorboards. Inside the room, the floorboards creaked again, soft and deliberate, as though someone was taking slow, measured steps. My throat tightened as I pressed myself into the corner, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with a suffocating tension. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, twisting and curling like smoke. I scanned the room frantically, but there was no one there. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the old light overhead. I tightened my grip on my phone, the edges digging into my palm. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard, which was the title of the recent story Cam had published, "Waiting for Cool." It was my voice, not just similar, exactly mine. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The room was empty. But then I saw it, my reflection in the cracked mirror above the dresser. It wasn't me. The face staring back at me was identical to mine, but the expression was all wrong. The smile was too wide, too sharp, as though the skin was stretched too tightly over the bone. And the eyes, they were hollow, empty, black voids that seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer. "You can't hide from yourself," it said, the grin widening. "Question?" the question asked. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, the movement slow and unnatural. "I'm not the one who wants," it said, its voice twisting and echoing in the small room. "You invited me, remember? You looked." The room seemed to darken around me, the shadows stretching and shifting as though alive. The reflection stepped forward, not in the mirror, but out of it. Its form twisted and flickered like a broken image on a screen, the edges of its body blurring and reforming. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was me, and yet it wasn't. "Where are you going to run?" it asked, its voice dripping with mockery. "There's only one of you, and now I'm it." The thing lunged at me, its arms stretching unnaturally long. I bolted toward the door, wrenching the chair aside and fumbling with the lock. My hands shook so badly it felt like an eternity before the door finally gave way. I ran into the cold night, the gravel crunching under my feet as I sprinted toward my car. I didn't dare look back. "Again?" I threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it in one frantic motion. My chest heaved, and my fingers fumbled with the keys as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. "Come on," I shouted, twisting the key harder. Through the windshield, the dark parking lot stretched before me, bathed in the faint glow of the inn's flickering sign. It was empty, eerily so, as if the world had held its breath. For a brief, maddening moment, I thought maybe I'd escaped, and then I saw him. He stood at the far end of the lot, perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, that same hollow smile carved across his face. Even from this distance, I could feel his gaze piercing through me, cold and invasive, like fingers clawing at my mind. I turned the key again. The engine roared to life, and relief flooded me like a crashing wave. I didn't think. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't talk to anyone since. "Why, it's a fair basement," Crane replied, rubbing his eyes. The road stretched ahead, a dark ribbon cutting through the endless night. My headlights illuminated nothing but asphalt and the occasional shadow of trees whipping past. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The car's rearview mirror vibrated with the engine's hum. My eyes flicked to it instinctively, and my stomach dropped. The driver was at work, probably with his 2 cargoes. He glanced up from... He was in the back seat, sitting there perfectly calm, his empty eyes meeting mine in the reflection. "You can't run from yourself," he said, his voice low and cold. I screamed, twisting the wheel violently. The car skidded, tires screeching as it veered off the road and into the ditch. The impact was jarring, throwing me against the seatbelt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in deafening silence. My head throbbed as I unbuckled and stumbled out of the car, my legs barely holding me up. The night was impossibly dark, the world around me a void. I turned to the car, expecting to see him there, but the back seat was empty. For a moment I thought it was over, and then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, my heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of darkness. I said, "Just the endless expanse of darkness." "Stop this," I shouted, my voice echoing into the void. "What do you want from me?" The laughter came again, closer this time, surrounding me. "What do I want?" the voice said, its tone almost amused. "I already told you." It became so loud that my head spun. From the shadows he emerged, not running, not rushing, but walking steadily toward me. His face, my face, was twisted into something inhuman, his smile stretching impossibly wide. He said, "I want you." I backed away, stumbling over the uneven ground. "You're not real," I shouted. "You're not me." He tilted his head, the way a predator does when it knows its prey has nowhere to go. "Aren't I?" "But..." The shadows around him seemed to writhe, pulling at the edges of his form. His voice grew louder, deeper, as though 100 versions of me were speaking at once. "You looked, you invited me, and now, there's only room for one of us." He laughed. I fell backward, landing hard on the cold ground. Pain shot through me, but I barely noticed. My hand searched blindly for something, anything, to defend myself. And then I felt it. The phone. The shattered screen glowed faintly in the dark, its light flickering like a heartbeat. Without thinking, I grabbed it and held it up. The figure froze, his twisted smile faltering. The phone screen flared brighter, illuminating his face in harsh, unnatural light. "No," he screamed, his voice warping into a guttural roar. "You can't escape me." The phone's light grew blinding, filling my vision entirely. The last thing I saw was his face, my face, twisting in agony as the shadows consumed him. When I woke up, it was morning. The car was gone. The inn was gone. I was lying on the side of an empty highway, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Number 13. The screen was cracked, but it was still on. One contact remained in the list. Me. "She will help," said the voice from the window of the lobby below us. And as I stared at it, the phone buzzed. It was Lisa, the call, or my own number. Alas, the screen flickered, and before I could stop it, the call connected. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. From the other end came the reply, soft and mocking. "You can't run from yourself." And then, the laughter. Story 2, Unlocked Door. I was exhausted when I got home, the kind of exhaustion that made every step feel heavier, every thought slower. Work had been hell, and all I wanted was to collapse on the couch and forget the world existed for a while. But as I reached my apartment door, something stopped me in my tracks. It was open. Not wide open, just ajar. Barely. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd rushed out in the morning and hadn't pulled it shut all the way. Maybe the lock hadn't clicked. But deep down, I knew better. The hallway was silent, the dim light overhead casting long shadows on the walls. I pushed the door open with one finger, the hinges creaking softly. "Stand aside," I told them. I nodded toward the door and they both hesitated. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. No answer. I stepped inside, every sense on high alert. The apartment looked normal, exactly as I'd left it. The living room was tidy, the kitchen counters were clear, and the faint smell of coffee lingered from the morning. My ears caught an unmistakable muffled response from the morning, but something felt off. I walked through each room, my heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. The bathroom was empty. The spare room was untouched. The bedroom was empty except for a pile of dirty laundry. The bed. That's when I noticed the curtains. They were drawn shut. I never closed the curtains. I liked the morning light to flood in, and I hadn't touched them in weeks. My throat tightened as I crossed the room, pulling the fabric aside. Nothing, just the view of the street below, cars crawling past under the orange glow of the streetlights. I turned back toward the bed, and that's when I saw it. On the bedside table where I usually left my keys was a photograph. I stared at the photograph, my pulse quickening. It wasn't mine. I'd never seen it before. The edges were slightly curled, the surface glossy and new, as though it had just been printed. But it wasn't the condition of the photo that made my skin crawl. It was what was in it. It showed my bedroom, my bed, my curtains. But the focus of the image wasn't the room. It was the man standing in it. Callie noted his discomfort and elbowed him gently in the ribs. He was in the center of the frame, facing the camera, his features partially obscured by shadows. His head was slightly tilted, his posture unnaturally stiff. And though his face was hard to make out, there was no mistaking where he was. Williamson, he was standing right where I was now. My throat tightened as I looked around the room, half expecting to see him still there. But the bedroom was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the heater. His gaze found mine as he stood there, a sharp bird drifting over from one. His jaw was tightened as he steadily took his time. I flipped the photo over, hoping for some kind of explanation. The back was blank, save for one thing. A single word had been cut out of it. A date. Today's date. Today's date. I couldn't think straight. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Someone had been in my apartment. There was no other explanation. They'd been here in this room taking pictures. But why? I searched the apartment again, my footsteps hurried and uneven. The closets, the cupboards, even under the bed. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anyone hiding. But as I returned to the living room, I noticed something new. The lock on the front door. It was scratched. Faint marks running along the edge of the deadbolt. I could have sworn they hadn't been there before. My stomach turned as I realized what it meant. Someone hadn't just been inside. They'd tried to keep me out. I needed answers. My first thought was to call the police. But what would I even say? Someone left a creepy photo in my apartment? They'd think I was imagining things. Instead, I decided to double-check the door. Maybe I'd been careless, left it unlocked, and someone had taken advantage. It was the only explanation that made sense. I crouched by the door, inspecting the scratches more closely. They were faint, like someone had been trying to pick the lock, but hadn't wanted to leave obvious marks. My fingers touched a soft, uncomfortable thing. A joint, and then the handle moved. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The handle jiggled slightly, just enough to make a faint metallic clink. Someone was on the other side. I backed away, my heart hammering. The handle twisted again, harder this time, as though whoever was there was growing impatient. I grabbed the deadbolt and shoved it into place, my hands shaking. The sound of metal sliding into the lock seemed to echo in the silent apartment. For a moment the handle stopped moving, and then came the knock. It wasn't loud or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like someone announcing their presence in the most unsettling way possible. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. The knocker came again. My hands fumbled for my phone. I dialed the number for building security, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen blinked, then froze, the signal dropping to nothing. I stared at the door, my heart racing. And then I saw it. A shadow under the crack of the door. It stretched across the floor, unnaturally long, shifting as though whoever was standing there was moving closer. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice breaking. A boom. The shadow still, and then slowly it started to seep under the door. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving as the shadow crept under the door. It wasn't natural. Shadows don't move like that. They don't seep like liquid, twisting and curling as though they're alive. "Leave me alone," I shouted. But the words sounded weak, hollow in the suffocating silence. The shadow moved with deliberate slowness, spreading across the floor like spilled ink. It stretched toward me, thin tendrils reaching, curling, inching closer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a chair, and shoved it between me and the creeping darkness. Routine, like getting in shape. The shadow stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly still. My pulse thundered in my ears, the air so heavy it felt like I was drowning. Then the knocking returned, louder this time, more forceful. It wasn't just a knock, it was a demand. I backed into the living room, my hands shaking. The knocking grew more insistent, each sound reverberating through the apartment. And then it stopped. "Would you like me to stay a while?" I asked. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't, because now there were footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from inside the apartment. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, but there was nothing there. No one who could have made the sound. Murdered. Murdered the third. The footsteps came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking. No answer. The air seemed to hum, a low vibration that made the walls feel like they were closing in. I grabbed my phone again, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen flickered and died in my hand. And then I saw it. A photograph? It was lying on the coffee table now, face up, though I was certain I'd left it in the bedroom. My stomach turned as I noticed something new about it. There was no one in the picture anymore. It was just her. The man, the intruder, was gone, leaving only the empty room. He looked around the room. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I picked up the photo. The surface felt colder than it should have, almost icy. As I stared at it, the air around me seemed to shift, growing colder with each passing second. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure was standing in the hallway. I didn't see him fully, just the outline, distorted and flickering like a bad signal, but the shape was unmistakable. Tall, motionless, staring at me from the shadows. "Oh, get out," I whispered, clutching the photo like a shield. The figure didn't move, and the person continued to sit. And then, as if in response to my words, the lock on the front door clicked open. The sound of the lock clicking open echoed through the apartment, sharp and final, like the snap of a guillotine. My blood turned to ice as the door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing the darkness of the hallway beyond. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath clouding in the dim light. My legs refused to move as I stared at the open doorway, every instinct screaming at me to run, but the figure in the hallway was already stepping inside. He moved slowly, deliberately, his form half shrouded in shadows. The closer he came, the more I realized how wrong he was. His body was too tall, his limbs too long, his movements unnaturally smooth, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. But his face was mine. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. Every line, every flaw, every detail down to the scar on my cheek from when I'd fallen off my bike as a kid. But the expression wasn't mine. The face grinned, too wide, stretching the skin until it looked ready to tear. His eyes were black pits, empty and endless, and yet I felt his gaze bore into me, pinning me in place. "You shouldn't have locked the door," he said, his voice soft, mocking. It was my voice, but distorted, layered as though a dozen versions of me were speaking at once. "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. The grin widened. "I'm the one who belongs here. You're the stranger." He stumbled backward, clutching the photograph like it might somehow protect me. "This is my home," I shouted, though the words felt hollow in the suffocating air. The squat man laughed harshly and said, "I once had a mother like this." The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. He stepped closer, his movements jerky, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "Is it?" he asked, his voice dripping with malice. The shadows in the room began to shift, crawling along the walls and floor like living things. They reached for me, stretching and twisting, their forms melding into grotesque shapes that flickered and pulsed like they were alive. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down. I screamed, thrashing against the icy tendrils, but they tightened, dragging me closer to him. "Let me go!" I shouted, my voice breaking. He crouched down, his face inches from mine. His grin softened, twisting into something almost pitying. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You're not supposed to be here. This isn't your life." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. "You don't belong," he said, his tone final. The shadows surged upward, wrapping around my chest, pulling me further into the cold, suffocating dark. My vision blurred as I fought against them, but my strength was fading. "Please," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The figure stood, towering over me as the shadows consumed my body. The last thing I saw was his face, my face, staring down at me with an expression I couldn't read. I was no longer alone. And then the landlord found the apartment empty a week later. There was no sign of me, no sign of a struggle. Just an open door and a single photograph lying on the living room floor. In the photo, the apartment looked exactly as it always had. But in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was me.